Hey guys, welcome to Recapped Movies. Today I am going to explain an action and sci-fi film called The Tomorrow War. Warning, spoilers ahead. The film opens in Miami Beach as Dan Forrester and a number of other soldiers fall from the sky amidst a devastated landscape. Dan lands in a pool alongside other people, who continue falling into the pool. Dan also sees people falling to their death as they were not lucky enough to be able to land in the pool unlike the others. Jump back 28 years earlier to December 2022. Dan is a biology teacher that lives with his wife Emmy and daughter Murray. At a Christmas party, Dan is waiting to hear back about a job at a research institute. He gets a phone call informing him that they have picked someone else for the position. Dan takes out his anger on objects near him, showing that he wanted this job very much. Disappointed, Dan goes back inside to watch the World Cup with his family and tells to his wife that he is meant to do something special with his life. Meanwhile, his daughter reassures him that everything will be fine. While they watch the World Cup, the arena suddenly has some kind of wormhole open up, with several soldiers from the future coming out before the confused viewers. A female soldier, Lieutenant Hart, announces to everyone that in 30 years' time from that moment, humanity will be wiped from the face of the earth due to an overwhelming alien invasion. The last hope is to recruit anybody they can to jump to the future and prevent humanity's extinction. A year later, riots and anti-war protests have gone on as the draft has been happening since the initial announcement, and there have been more casualties than anything. Hope for the future continues to dwindle. Even Dan's students can't focus on their work because they feel that everyone is just going to die anyway. Dan motivates his students to not give up so soon. Dan is later called to report for a draft. After undergoing an evaluation, he learns that he meets the qualifications because he has already died between the present and the time leading up to the invasion. He has a device placed onto his arm that will aid him in time jumping. It is also revealed that Dan was a squad leader in Iraq 15 years earlier. Given 24 hours to settle his affairs, Dan goes to Emmy's job where she works as a therapist for people who have returned from the draft. Emmy sees the device on Dan's arm. Emmy tells Dan that there is one person who can help get the family to safety, but it is Dan's estranged father James, whom he resents for abandoning him and his mother a long time ago. Dan visits James, who doesn't trust the government and has gone off-grid. Before Dan can ask for help, James says he has never wanted his help, which infuriates Dan because that's the only thing he ever wanted from him, although James says that he would have only made things worse for Dan and his mother. So, in the end, Dan refuses to get help from James. Dan returns home to Emmy and Murray. Emmy hugs Dan thinking that he got the device off with the help of his father, but finds out that it wasn't the case. Dan convinces her to let him go as that is the only way. Dan has a chat with Murray and tells her that he will be fine and will come back if he goes to the future. The two are heartbroken and hug Dan goodbye. Dan reports to the draft, where he meets other people like Charlie, Dorian, Nora, and Cowan. The draftees are told about the process of time jumping and the plan for their mission. Charlie tells Dan that they send people who have died before the war to avoid a paradox, while also noting that Dorian managed to jump back after killing an alien, which they refer to as white spikes. This surprises Dan as Charlie also tells him that he has jumped to the future 3 times already and is still willing to go back each time he comes back. Without any time to prepare, the draftees are alerted to pass through the jump link into the future where they will end up on Miami Beach. Things go wrong because the draftees are dropped off way higher than the plan was, causing several to fall to their deaths while Dan and others land in the water. After getting out, Dan reports to Romeo Command, which is the colonel, who informs the team that the military has issued a blanket bombardment on the area to wipe out any living things. She tells the team to rescue lab personnel before the bombs are dropped. The team moves forward into the facility where they find the lab crew dead, but they recover their research. Soon, the team comes face to face with the white spikes, who are fast and deadly with whip-like tails. Many of the draftees ended up dying in this encounter. Dan and his crew manage to kill some white spikes as they run, but Cowan falls through a tunnel, and Dan attempts to help him. The white spikes are closing in, so Nora and Cowan stay behind to hold off as many as possible, just before the military drops the bombs on the tunnel, killing Nora, Cowan, and the white spikes. The draftees are then rescued by the colonel. The surviving draftees wake up at a camp in the Dominican Republic. Dan meets the colonel. They have a chat and it turns out that they have the same last name as Forrester. He then finds out that she is an adult Murray. She has some estrangement toward Dan for going through with the draft. She tells Dan that her team has located a female white spike whose physiology may be key in taking down the rest of the hive. The team comes across the cave containing the female. She tries to resist the capture, but as she sees that it's futile, she calls in the male white spikes. All of the male white spikes rush into the scene and start coming down. Some get shredded by chopper blades while soldiers continue to fight them off. The team manages to cage the female, though, with Dan nearly compromising the mission to save Murray. She reprimands him and then reveals to him that he died 7 years after the draft in a car accident, and Murray witnessed his final moments, all of this being after he returned from the draft and became disillusioned and left his family, hence her estrangement toward him. Dan realizes that in the end he ended up becoming just like his father, as he also left his family like Dan does in the future. The team brings the female back to an oil rig where the jump link is, so that they can produce a toxin from the female's blood that will wipe out all the white spikes. The female has been sedated. Dan and Murray spend the whole night trying to make the toxin from the female's blood. After a lot of time, Murray finally manages to produce the toxin that can wipe them all out. The female white spike ends up waking up and calls in all the male white spikes to get rescued. Soon, many more aliens overrun the base and attack, leading to another ferocious battle. The time in the jump link is about to expire, and the female white spike breaks free. Dan and Murray try to fight off the white spikes while the female is also hunting them, as she has grown in animosity with Murray. Murray gets hurt, Dan tries to help her but she cannot move as the wound was vital. Dan wants to save her, but Murray tells him that they would have never made it anyway and tells him to make sure that this future never happens by killing the white spikes in his own present. The female finds and attacks them, but the bridge collapses because of an explosion and Murray almost falls down with the female white spike. Although Dan tries to save her, she lets go of his hand so that she and the female can die while Dan and the surviving draftees return to their present year. Dan desperately jumps after her, but before he can get her, the jump link activates and Dan is pulled back to his own time. Upon returning, Dan tries desperately to go back and attempt to save Murray, but it is futile as the jump link is now offline, making the jump back impossible. He has also managed to hold onto the toxin, as they were unable to pry it from his hands even while he was unconscious. Dan returns home. While talking to Emmy, he tells her that he met Murray as an adult and worked with her. Dan starts focusing on the promise he made with Murray in the future and focuses on completing the mission. Emmy suggests that the aliens didn't arrive in 2048 when the invasion began, but that they may have been there much earlier. Dan then goes to a bar where he finds Dorian, who tells him that he has terminal cancer, hence being the reason he was never afraid of going into the future. Dan asks him about a white spike claw that he kept as a souvenir, and they discover ash on it that came from Russia. Dan asks one of his students about info regarding volcanic ash, leading to all of them deducing that the white spikes have already been on Earth this whole time and were thawed out by global warming. Dan, Charlie, and Dorian attempt to get help from a government higher-up to allow them to take on a mission to Russia, but he denies them. What a fucking idiot. Dan then goes to James for help, and they, along with the other soldiers and Lieutenant Hart, make it to Russia and discover the site of the frozen white spikes by using explosions to reveal the crashed spaceship below the frozen ice. Before going into the spaceship, Dan gives everyone a warning that if they go into the spaceship then they may not be able to return out of it alive. Everybody still agrees to go in and they proceed to do so. James and Charlie are to keep a watch at the entrance to not let any of White Spikes leave the cave in the worst-case scenario. They find out that the ship the White Spikes came in on did not belong to them, but rather to a different species that was carrying the White Spikes as cargo to eliminate other planets. They proceed to inject the toxin into the White Spikes, but the aliens wake up and begin to attack. After an intense battle, Dorian sacrifices himself to obliterate the White Spikes with a bomb. Unfortunately, the female White Spike manages to escape the cave while James and Dan follow her to kill her with the toxin. They manage to inject her with the poison, but she bites her arm off to prevent it from spreading. James tries to create a distraction by sacrificing himself. James asks for Dan's forgiveness for all that he has done to him in the past, knowing that he is about to die. Dan does a surprise attack on the female White Spike while also saving James. After beating her further, Dan shoves the toxin into the female's throat and knocks her off a cliff where she splatters, officially ending all the White Spikes for good. Dan and James lie down to rest and are happy about killing the White Spikes for good. Dan, Charlie, and James are the only survivors of this incident. News about the war's prevention spreads, with the higher-up from earlier taking credit for Dan and the others making the trip. Back home, Dan reunites with Emmy and Murray, and he introduces Murray to James while appreciating his family. Subscribe for more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like on the video to help the channel out.